This is the Roller Coaster Podcast, and I'm your host, Lucy Q. Life is a wild ride. It has twists and turns. It's scary, exciting, and downright fun. So throw your head back, arms in the air, and come along with me for the ride.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride.
Today's guest, Sonia Lewis, at the age of 7, decided not to say the Pledge of Allegiance because she didn't see liberty and justice for all. I think that's pretty gutsy for a 7-year-old. That little girl is now all grown up, and she continues to fight for people to be treated equally, regardless of race, class, color, gender, or economic status, through her company, Ascribe Educational Consulting. Hi, Sonia.
Hi, Lucy. How are you this afternoon?
I'm good. How are you?
I cannot complain. It is sunny here in California. It is summertime, so some of the kids are out of school, others are going to summer school, and so we're still busy.
I hear you. Yeah, I'm in Canada, and I'm on the coast, and we don't usually have humidity like we are having right now. So if you see me sweating a little bit, it's because I have to close all the windows in my office to record. Right. And I don't have air conditioning here, so
that's a thing.
It's a little warm.
Yeah, a little warm.
So that's quite a young age, 7, to realize that something was off. Now, was that just one incident that you decided not to say the Pledge of Allegiance, or was that like an ongoing thing?
I think, okay, so let me just back up just a little bit now that I know what I know, because, Oprah says, when you know better, you do better.
Exactly.
So I have a degree in history and psychology. And with that being said, one of the things in basic psychology or intro psychology that I learned early on is that young people learn right from wrong. They can understand difference between the ages of 3 and 5. And there is this ideation out there in the psychology world that especially young people who grow up in marginalized settings, they experience that kind of difference in understanding even at an earlier age. And so 7 might seem young, but it's very much right in line with where psychologists said the mental development and psychology of young people. So to your question of, was this a one-time incident? I would say no. I would say that probably at the age 3, 4, 5, I was starting to see difference, right? And seeing those differences in people who looked like myself, my family, or my community, it just made a huge difference in what the conclusion that I was able to draw for myself.
That makes sense. I had a conversation with our oldest yesterday. He's 21, and he was telling us a story about when he was probably in grade 3, so probably that 7, 8-year-old mark. And he said the teacher was talking about Martin Luther King and his importance and everything that he did. And my son, he was confused. He didn't understand what the problem was. And he expressed this to the teacher. And the teacher said, well, some people aren't liked because of their skin color. And he didn't understand it. He's like, what do you mean? What do you mean that I'm not going to like somebody just because of how they look or how they act or anything like that? So, I can see how that age is sort of pivotal, and, how that sort of shaped your life. How did that then carry through to, what you pursued career-wise?
It was one of those things that conclusion that I came to was coupled with the fact that, and I always kind of give some backstory so that folks understand, like, there's a bigger picture. Everyone has a backstory that shapes their walk and their journey. And so my mom was actively involved in the Black Panther Party. She would attend Black Panther meetings. I am from the Bay Area, from Oakland, California. My father, when he was discharged from the Vietnam War, was one of five Black officers who were hired on with the Richmond Police Department to integrate the department for the first time. And within 18 months to 2 years, all of them were fired because of one reason or another. You know, there's this thing in systems where we say that we will do one thing on paper, but, you know, in order to make ourselves continue the perpetuation of the normalcy of racism and white supremacy, we're going to choose to not integrate and do so with, you know, a lack of care. And so when I'm around the time that I made the decision not to say the Pledge of Allegiance, I had overheard my father telling the story to my mom that I had a cousin who was not of a adult mental capacity, and he was killed in the middle of the street by the police. And so I'm hearing these things and I'm seeing the difference in my community. And I'm saying to myself, okay, I understand this definition of liberty. We had just done an activity on the Statue of Liberty, as a matter of fact. And so I understand the concept of liberty. And I came home and I asked my parents, what do you think justice meant or means? And so that helped me shape the decision that I made. Let's flip ahead to the time that I was 18 and I went off to college and I took my college entrance exam. Now, mind you, I considered myself a scholar. I considered myself academically advanced, comparatively speaking to in reference to my classmates. I was the salutatorian of my class, did very well in high school, but I failed my entrance exams. And so that was the first time that I experienced what I considered failure. And from an academic perspective, it opened my eyes to what educational equity should be like for all students across this country.
So you failed your entrance exams.
Yeah.
What was, and again, the educational system and getting into college and university is very different in the US versus Canada. So why do you feel that you failed those exams?
I think that our education system does depending on the state, right? Because here in America, there are states who put a lot of emphasis in and making sure that equity is more broadly stroked and divided across their system. But in California, I soon discovered that, you know, being the number 5 economy in the world, that we were suffering at the probably the 30 and 40th percentile when it comes to education. And so what I attribute it to is a realization that our California education system just did not invest in communities of color, in schools that were schools that had students who were marginalized. They just didn't put the investment in. And so when we talk about that equity piece, we are also talking about what are the resources that are being distributed, right? So that students can advance and achieve, so that we don't just look good on paper. And I felt like I just looked good on paper. I was accepted into some of the most prestigious colleges and universities around this country. But I will tell you, my freshman year going in that summer, I took my freshman entrance exams and I failed. I had to eventually take 2 classes that were very remedial and that I did not get college credit for. It was called entrance reading and mathematics. And so it was almost like an ego blow. It was like, wow, okay, is this telling me that I can't read or that I have a comprehension issue? There are lots of things that were going on in my mind, but I just knew that I failed for the first time, and it was a huge eye opener for me.
And that then shaped your journey.
Absolutely, most definitely.
So let me ask you this, because I see people confusing what is and what isn't racism. You know, I'll often see that just because somebody makes a remark, the immediate rebuttal is, well, you're racist. And it's, you know, it can be a bit of a gray area. And quite honestly, as I said before, when we were chatting, it's a gray area, and it's hard to have these conversations if you're not in the environment, because you also don't want to ask questions that can be construed as being offensive. And I said to you, my purpose for this conversation is to seek to understand, because your experiences are drastically different than mine. So for you, how would you describe racism?
So I would describe racism. I mean, Webster, as in the dictionary, does a huge disservice to not including, I think, the conditionary terms that go along with racism, that where confusion can come up. So racism is when one group of people use their power and influence to marginalize, make fragile in community, or deny access to things like resources around housing and medical care, the ability to have your vote heard, and representation in educational settings. So that's what textbook wise the definition of racism is. I think where people get confused and they make blanket statements in calling a person a racist, which I think in this day and time, we have to really begin to peel back the onion, peel back the layers, that individuals are most times, and this is what I've run across, right? Is that in most situations, people are not racist by intent. They may perpetuate racist behaviors. They may unintentionally or just superficially lean on the conditioning that we all have been taught growing up in society, especially in Western, the Americas in particular. And so even I, as a dark-skinned Black woman, I have perpetuated racist behaviors because I have worked in systems that have kept certain student demographics marginalized, vulnerable, and failing. And so I had to make a decision when I left the teaching profession. How was I going to impact that change? And so that's how I started my business. But we have to be very clear when we use terms like racist and racism. And do we really mean prejudice? Do we mean stereotype? Do we mean implicit biases, right? And we all have to reckon that at some time or another, if we are not acknowledging the elephant in the room, that racism is legitimately a thing. It was derived. It is in my opinion, a false social construct that the founding fathers of America really and truly designed to protect their best interests and the legacy of their best interests. And that protection meant that at all costs, other groups would not have access to resources. And so in a nutshell, I hope that I offered a comprehensive definition of what racism is.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned your founding fathers of America, and they set things up so basically they benefit the most. But I think that's also the definition of government in general, because I mean, especially today, all we're seeing is, in some ways, I'm just seeing more and more division, because people are out just to get what is for them. They're not looking. And I mean, this just could be my Pollyanna view of things, but we're failing to see that we're all just human beings from my perspective. And for me, I find that anytime we use labels, it creates an environment for racism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's unfortunate. And I see this as a global, issue, as a global pandemic. I see it as when COVID hit the world, that it really exposed the very, oh my goodness, deep rooted, and pervasive and harmful and oppressive ways in which we've allowed our government to come in and dictate how inhumane we treat each other. And so at the core of the work that I do when I'm going into organizations, and I'm prior to this past year, I didn't have the freedom and flexibility to say, I'm coming in to do anti-racism work like I am today. Like I couldn't stand in that truth. I had to earn, that path as I opened that door, right? And so prior to the murder of George Floyd, my conversations with organizational leaders and corporate executives was allow me to come in and do a climate and culture check, right? And let's assess, what your teams feel about diversity and equity within your organization. And I've been in business for over a decade now. And so it did lend me, an opportunity to walk into these spaces. But once I was in those spaces and I, was able to gain the trust of the people who were in those spaces, I was then able to say, okay, maybe let's have a conversation about race. Not giving it the label of racism and calling people racist, but let's have a very courageous and vulnerable conversation about the constructs of race. How did we get here? Because if we're not willing to explore and understand in a shared language, a shared value kind of perspective, what the construct of race is, then it's almost like we're shooting ourselves in the foot and we're accepting the norm that has perpetuated and divided people for centuries. I don't think that we're at a more divisive state of being today than we have been over the past 400 years. I just think that it's broadly more accepted and out there, and people are really more willing, I should say, to have those conversations and engage.
So how are some of the ways that somebody might realize that their views on race are, let's say, out of line?
Yeah, and that's a hard question, right? Because as I've alluded to, we've all been conditioned to a certain degree.
Yeah.
All of us, I have conversations with my very Black parents and Black family members, and we have conversations around where do we feel like the ball either was dropped. And so when we have these conversations around race, it's like, okay, yes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a phenomenal leader, when it comes to civil rights and race relations, but wherein lies the culpability of the Black community in dealing with those expectations and boundaries that have come out of. And I would push back to anyone who says, okay, well, now you have the ability to vote, or now you have the ability to be employed in a variety of situations, or be educated anywhere you want to. Why doesn't your community in a broad sense pull yourselves up by, the bootstraps? I say that unfortunately, it's been 400 years plus in the making that has allowed for the perpetuation of what, and I don't think it's, I don't want to put all of the earnest on the label of racism and racist. I want to call a thing, and the reality at the root of it is white supremacy. And that construct of race said from the founding fathers, as colonization was happening globally, right? Not just in America, but globally, that we are going to put people in categories based on the colors of their skin, based on their religion, based on their cultural practices. And so that's, I think, is more of a conversation that is more fruitful when people get to the bottom of an understanding that race is a false narrative. And if we get to the root of it, it is a division of the have and the have-nots.
And, through all of these challenges and seeking equality, you then get caught up in the conversations because, we're also conditioned that there's winners and that there's losers. And that a lot of the time, regardless of what side of the table you're on, you're going to get the feeling of winning and losing. And I've seen in some circumstances, I don't know if the term is correct, but sort of reverse racism, where, you're being called out we have two sons. They're 21 and 19. And they have had things said to them because, they're white guys. And it's like, they're like, well, I don't have anything against you. What's your problem with me? But they're immediately classified as, well, you're a young man, white man. You don't deserve to have anything because you've oppressed us.
Right.
And that sort of fuels that fire of win-lose.
Absolutely. And that's the unfortunate part, right? That is what I consider collateral damage. The things that I ask people who come from the demographic of privilege is to understand that, because by design, there has been this separation of who automatically gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. There's an angst in community, the marginalized community, the community that is left most open and vulnerable. And what I ask of people is to take a look at where you can use your privilege to benefit others. We really and truly have been sold a hill of beans that we come from a scarcity and that everything is from a deficit. There's no scare, at least in America. I will tell you that there's enough for everyone to win. And I would even venture, because Canada would probably be my next go-to if I had to leave this place, right? There are some other places that my husband and I have identified around the globe, but Canada is definitely on the list, like, of where could we easily escape to if we needed to, right? And so what I'm saying and what I know across the globe is that we've been sold a hill of beans. I use, if I can quote Malcolm X, he said, we've been bamboozled to believe that scarcity is a thing. Globally, even, there's enough for us globally all to be fed and nurtured and housed and not have the social just ills that continue to plague certain groups in our world. And so when we look at that, though, we have to be honest in the assessment of who typically is at the bottom of the totem pole. And so as I've done assessments of countries, I can remember graduating from Spelman, and my senior thesis was around the comparative study of chattel slavery in America and slavery in Brazil, and what the outcomes were, right? And so I can tell you that Brazil made a very concerted effort to erase the color line, and they treated people based on the caste system, which they felt was more fair. It still was inequitable. There were still
like, oh, let's just jump right from the frying pan into the fire on that one.
Right? So from one to another. But what it has done is it allowed for, when you think about people and seeing them just on the surface, there wasn't that divide. And so people can move in and out of those caste systems based on their ability to achieve in certain arenas. Whereas in America, chattel slavery said, no, we had a 1-drop rule. And so if you had 1 drop of Black blood, you were considered Black. Whereas in other countries that experienced racism in Central and South America, where slavery was also a thing, they had the 1-drop rule in the reverse. And so you had a way out of your Blackness. And so as you got lighter, because of your genetics, you could then be a part of the white class, regardless of how you presented. And so it's a tricky conversation. It's not easy. It takes a lot of courage. And Brené Brown, who is one of my favorite TED talkers.
Oh, yes, yes.
Brené, I said Brené.
Oh, yeah. Brené Brown, love her. Yeah.
Love her, love her, love her. She says that if we are not willing to be vulnerable, we are not willing to change. And so I would take that a step further, that vulnerability is uncomfortable.
Oh, and so it is. It's very uncomfortable. And, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells here because I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to offend anybody, but there's also questions and conversations that need to be had, that who am I going to have them with?
Absolutely.
How can we have conversations? And again, this goes back to the point I made earlier. We're just all beautiful souls here for a purpose.
Absolutely.
And sometimes I just feel that every time we try and classify and put a label on something, you're just causing more and more division. Now, here, one of the things that we're struggling with is, they're trying to erase history, where they're removing statues of and monuments, and actually there's destruction of monuments for anybody that they claim to have been racist in history. And there's a call out to rename schools, rename streets, rename everything in an effort to erase what happened.
Yeah.
And for me, I feel that that's dangerous because, okay, no, do we want kids going to school that's a school that's named after somebody that wasn't so positive in history? Probably not. But should we remove them from all of the conversation? Well,
Yeah, no.
How does that serve us if, you know, you're just setting yourself up for history to repeat itself? So, where does that come into the conversation of where do we remove certain things from our environment so that we're not perpetuating racism?
Absolutely. And that's the tough part, right? Because I definitely want to have the tough conversations around how do we get to equity, right? And so I'm no longer looking for the equal inequality. I've given up that, hope. I maybe was talked and used language like equality when I was younger, but I have more resources and more things in my tool belt to help explain why equality is a fallacy, right? We will never be at a state of equality. And so what I'm looking for is an understanding, shared language, shared values. Can we acknowledge things? And so it really and truly is baby steps. You have to start at the beginning. And starting at the beginning for some people could be laborsome. Starting at the beginning for some people can be scary because it makes them feel as though this is about blame and shame. But in order for us to get to a shared value of what humanity is and to be able to lift all of humanity, I oftentimes go back to the parable in the Bible and because people use the Bible as a tool to weaponize other people. And so I can remember being taught that there was a sheep herder and he had gathered most of the sheep. They're all gathered. And about 2 or 3 of them were outside of the pen. And he locked the pen and he said, "You all are safe. I need to go and spend my energy on those ones that are not safe." Right. And so when here in America, there's this conversation that's happening on a continuous basis about why are we saying and lifting this, this phrase, this question, this ideation of Black Lives Matter, right? Why are we not leaning on all lives matter? Well, the reality is I wish that all lives mattered. And until Black Lives Matter, we can't say all. And so let's get to the reason why the all is not applicable in this moment, because that's going to be the root, that should be the root of and the purpose of the conversation. I was sent a meme by one of my good friends in community, and she knows that I am very big on calling a thing and using clear language around these concepts of slavery and white supremacy and privilege, right? And so someone put on their Twitter page, they said, use clear language on slavery instead of erasing it. Instead of calling slaves, call them hostages. Instead of slave owners, call them human traffickers. Put these things in layman's terms so that people can understand the harm and oppression that came out of the system of slavery. Instead of slave catchers, call them police. Instead of plantations, call them death camps. Instead of calling a Black woman who had a child with her slave master a mistress, call her a rape victim. Instead of discipline, call it torture and murder. Instead of overseers, torturers, trading, kidnapping, profit, theft. Middle passage, call it genocide. And so I was reading this and I was like, oh my gosh, this is calling a thing a thing. And so when we start to replace words that we commonly hear and have accepted, through the erasure, through the whitewashing, through I'm more concerned about the feelings and the feel goods of systems that were not feel good systems, we can begin to peel back the layers and not detach ourselves from or obscure the vision of those antiquated, euphoristic feelings of making our countries and our governments feel good about what they've done historically. And so in specifically going to the heroes that we have lend ourselves to, these statues that are now coming under question, I have mixed feelings because I don't want to erase history, though I feel as though I would be a walking contradiction if I said it's good to erase those statues from the history books and those people from the history books, the same way that I feel that Black history has been erased from the global perspective, right? And so I feel that I would be a walking contradiction. So we have to be honest about how we then position who these people we have lifted in community. And so that's the conversation that I want to have. I want to be able to say that I attended a school, Woodrow Wilson Elementary School. It is now called Michelle Obama Elementary School. There was a name change because Woodrow Wilson was very oppressive in nature, right? And so I'm wanting to have those conversations. But am I willing to say that Woodrow Wilson is not a part of American history? No. Do we want to erase the legacy? No, we just want to have a truthful conversation about what those contributions and embrace the harm. Like if we, what I appreciate about the young generation right now, they are not accepting of these generational curses. They are not going, they are saying, I don't want to continue to perpetuate. And so to speak to your young sons who are 19 and 20, you said 21, 22?
Yeah.
You know, they weren't alive, neither were you and I when slavery transpired. And so I would want to have a conversation with folks of my generation to say, yeah, we weren't alive. The blame and shame shouldn't be left on our shoulders, but we have to recognize and acknowledge that has been a system built that allows for privilege for some folks and not privilege for others. And so that I think is more crucial to the conversation than just saying that my fragility is setting in. And so, yes, I recognize I have privilege, but, you know, to turn blind eye and say that I'm going to go into the comforts of my home and ignore what's going on the outside of my home is also inhumane.
Sonia, this is such an important and interesting conversation. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. This work is like my life work. I have created Ascribe Educational Consulting as an intergenerational, family-led and Black woman-owned business. And folks can find us at Ascribe, ASCRIBE, success.com. And you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram with that @Ascribe Success. You know, I will tell you that when I get new clients who come in and I do my assessment, my opening assessment with them, I bring it back to my team. The youngest person on my team is 8 years old. He's one of my brand warriors. The oldest person on my team is 72 years old. She's my mother. And we have a conversation about, here are the issues. Now, what are your perspective? From an 8-year-old perspective, hearing that, what does that make you feel? From a 71-year-old's perspective, what does that make you feel? And then I can offer my 50-year-old perspective. My daughter, who is in her 30s, can offer her perspective, and we can have conversations around bringing solutions to our clients.
If you're looking at connecting with Sonia, make sure you're checking out the show notes. I'm going to have all of our links in there. And Sonia, thank you so much for joining me today and helping me understand the situation better.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was an honor.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Roller Coaster Podcast. Want to chat or share your ideas about today's show? Pop me an email at hello@therollercoasterpodcast.com. Don't forget to connect with me on Facebook and Instagram at The Roller Coaster Podcast. Our theme song, Roller Coaster, was performed by The Lucky Setback. Audio editing by the one and only Jeff Quigley of Quigley Creative.
Life is like a roller